The district attorney looked down at my 3-year-old daughter and said, "Maybe if your mommy chose better clients, you wouldn't be eating government cheese." He had no idea that little girl would be the one to end his career. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya Johnson and I'm a public defender here in Atlanta, Georgia. For the past 5 years I've been fighting for people who can't afford high-priced lawyers, people who look like me, who grew up like me, who deserve justice just like everyone else. I never thought I'd be telling this story. When I graduated from Emory Law School, I had dreams of making a difference, of being the voice for the voiceless. I believed in the system, believed that justice was truly blind, that the color of my skin wouldn't matter as long as I worked hard and proved myself. My journey to law school wasn't easy. I grew up in East Atlanta, where my grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. Grandma May worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a grocery store during the day and took in ironing on weekends. Despite the exhaustion that was always etched in the lines around her eyes, she never missed a parent-teacher conference, never failed to help me with homework, never stopped believing that education was my ticket to a better life. "Baby girl," she used to tell me as she helped me practice my reading at the kitchen table, "you got something special in that head of yours. Don't let anybody tell you differently. Don't let anybody make you small." Those words carried me through high school, where I was one of only 3 black students in my advanced placement classes. They carried me through my undergraduate years at Spelman College, where I discovered my passion for justice and equality. They carried me through law school, where I was often the only black woman in my classes, where professors would look right through me when I raised my hand, where study groups would mysteriously forget to invite me. But they also carried me to my first job as a public defender, where I finally felt like I had found my calling. Working with clients who came from backgrounds similar to mine, who had faced similar challenges, who needed someone to see their potential rather than just their mistakes, it felt like coming home. My daughter Zara is 3 years old, with bright eyes and an infectious laugh that can light up any room. She's my whole world, my reason for pushing through the long nights studying case files, my motivation when the work gets overwhelming. Every morning she'd kiss me goodbye and say, "Mommy, go help people today." It was our little ritual. Zara is everything I was at her age, but with a confidence I never had. She walks into any room like she belongs there, speaks to adults like she expects to be heard, asks questions without fear of being dismissed. Sometimes I watch her and wonder if this is what childhood looks like when you haven't yet learned to make yourself small, when you haven't yet absorbed the message that your voice doesn't matter. She loves books, especially stories about brave princesses and smart scientists. She's already reading Simple Words, and she has this way of pointing to pictures in her books and making up elaborate stories about what's happening. "This princess is helping people," she'll say, pointing to a random illustration. "She's making the bad guys be nice." Life was good. I had a small apartment in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy but clean and safe, with a little porch where Zara could ride her tricycle. My daughter was thriving in daycare, where her teachers constantly told me how bright and kind she was. I was building a reputation as someone who fought hard for her clients, someone who didn't give up, someone who saw possibilities where others saw lost causes. I specialized in cases involving young people, kids who made mistakes, who got caught up in situations bigger than themselves, who needed someone to believe in their potential for change. These were the cases that reminded me why I became a public defender in the first place. Every time I helped a teenager get a second chance, every time I convinced a judge to consider rehabilitation over punishment, every time I saw a young person turn their life around, I felt like I was honoring my grandmother's belief in the power of opportunity. The law office where I worked was diverse, supportive. My boss, Patricia Collins, was a black woman in her 50s who had spent 30 years fighting for justice. She took me under her wing from day one, teaching me not just about the law but about navigating a system that wasn't always welcoming to people like us. "Maya," she told me during my first week, "you're going to face challenges that your white colleagues will never even know exist. But don't let that discourage you. Use it to fuel your passion for justice. Let it remind you why this work matters." My colleagues respected my work, valued my dedication, and treated me as an equal. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. I'd wake up each morning with purpose, knowing that my voice could make a difference in someone's life. I had a routine that I loved. I'd drop Zara off at daycare, where she'd run to her teachers with excitement about what she was going to learn that day. Then I'd drive to the courthouse, often listening to NPR and mentally preparing for whatever challenges the day would bring. I'd spend my mornings in court, my afternoons meeting with clients or preparing cases, and my evenings at home with Zara, helping her with puzzles or reading stories until she fell asleep. But there was one person who made my professional life difficult: District Attorney Richard Hawthorne. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a way of carrying himself that suggested he had never been told no in his entire life. He'd been the DA for over 15 years, and he ran his office like a kingdom where he was the absolute ruler. Hawthorne had a reputation as a tough prosecutor, someone who never backed down from a fight, someone who believed that his job was to put criminals behind bars for as long as possible. The local newspapers loved him, especially when he made dramatic statements about being tough on crime and protecting law-abiding citizens from dangerous criminals. From the moment I started taking cases to trial, I noticed something about the way DA Hawthorne treated me. It was subtle at first, a dismissive glance here, a condescending comment there. When I'd approach him for plea negotiations, he'd make me wait longer than my white colleagues, sometimes keeping me standing in his outer office for 30 minutes or more while he finished important phone calls. When I'd present evidence, he'd question my competence in ways that felt personal rather than professional. He'd ask if I had actually read the case law I was citing, if I understood the constitutional principles I was invoking, if I was sure I had the experience necessary to handle such a complex case. At first, I told myself it was just his personality, that he was tough on everyone. I had heard stories about his confrontational style, his tendency to treat opposing counsel as personal enemies rather than professional adversaries. But as the months went by, I began to notice patterns that were harder to dismiss. In meetings with multiple defense attorneys, he would address the white lawyers by their titles: Ms. Anderson, Mr. Peterson, but call me simply Maya. He would interrupt me more frequently, question my arguments more aggressively, and dismiss my concerns more readily than those of my colleagues. The way his eyes would narrow when I walked into a room, the way he'd speak slower when addressing me as if I couldn't understand complex legal concepts, the way he'd make comments about those people when referring to my clients, it all added up to something I didn't want to acknowledge. There was also the way he talked about my clients that bothered me. When discussing white defendants, he would refer to them by name, acknowledge their backgrounds, sometimes even express regret about the circumstances that led to their arrests. But when talking about my clients, who were predominantly Black and Latino, he would use terms like career criminals, thugs, and the usual suspects. I kept my head down, focused on my work, and tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach every time I had to deal with his office. After all, I was there to serve my clients, not to make friends with the opposition. But the stress was taking its toll. I found myself losing sleep before court appearances where I knew I'd have to face Hawthorne. I started having headaches that would last for hours after particularly difficult interactions. Zara began asking why Mommy seemed sad sometimes, and I realized that my attempts to shield her from my professional struggles weren't entirely successful. I talked to Patricia about it, describing the way Hawthorne treated me compared to how he treated other attorneys. She listened carefully, nodding in recognition. I've heard similar stories from other attorneys of color, she told me. But Hawthorne is careful. He never crosses the line far enough to create grounds for a formal complaint. He's been doing this for years and he knows exactly how far he can push without facing consequences. That conversation was both validating and frustrating. It confirmed that what I was experiencing wasn't just in my head, but it also made clear that there might not be much I could do about it. Hawthorne was an elected official with significant political power, strong connections throughout the legal community, and a reputation for destroying the careers of anyone who challenged him. So I continued to endure his behavior, documenting incidents in my personal journal but not expecting that anything would ever come of it. I focused on my clients, on the cases I could win, on the small victories that reminded me why this work mattered. I had no idea that everything was about to change, that a routine day at the office would become the catalyst for events that would expose the truth about Richard Hawthorne and change the course of my career forever. The incident that would change everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I had to bring Zara to work with me because her daycare was closed for a staff training day. It was one of those unexpected situations that working mothers know all too well, when carefully laid plans suddenly fall apart and you have to improvise. I had called several babysitters the night before, but none were available on such short notice. My grandmother was visiting her sister in Birmingham, and I didn't have any other family in the area who could help. I briefly considered taking a sick day, but I had an important hearing scheduled and my client was counting on me. So I did what millions of working mothers do every day: I made it work. I packed Zara's backpack with coloring books, crayons, puzzles, and her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons that she'd had since she was a baby. I explained to her that she would need to be extra good that day, that Mommy had important work to do, and that she could help by being quiet and drawing pictures. "I'll be the goodest girl ever, Mommy," she promised, her 3-year-old pronunciation making me smile despite my stress about the situation. The case I was preparing for involved a 17-year-old named Marcus Williams, who had been charged with armed robbery. Marcus was a good kid who had made a bad decision. He had been with friends who decided to rob a convenience store, and although he claimed he didn't know what they were planning, he had been charged as an accomplice. The evidence was shaky at best. The security camera footage was grainy and unclear. The store clerk's identification was uncertain. He admitted that the lighting was poor and that he had been frightened during the incident. The alleged weapon was never found, and there were significant gaps in the prosecution's timeline that cast doubt on their version of events. I had spent weeks building a defense that I believed could result in either dropped charges or a plea deal for a much lesser offense. I had interviewed witnesses, analyzed the evidence, researched similar cases, and prepared arguments that I thought were compelling. This was exactly the kind of case that reminded me why I became a public defender. A young man's entire future hung in the balance. Marcus reminded me of boys I had grown up with in East Atlanta. Boys who weren't bad kids but who sometimes found themselves in bad situations. Boys who needed someone to see their potential rather than just their mistakes. Boys who deserved a second chance to prove that one moment of poor judgment didn't define their entire character. He was articulate, respectful, and clearly remorseful about what had happened. He had been working part-time at a fast food restaurant to help his mother pay bills while maintaining good grades in school. His teachers described him as polite and hard-working, and he had no prior criminal record. In my mind, this was exactly the kind of case where the justice system should focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Zara had been an angel that morning, sitting quietly in my office coloring while I reviewed my notes and prepared for what I hoped would be productive plea negotiations. She was working on a picture of our apartment, carefully coloring inside the lines and occasionally asking me questions about which colors she should use. "Mommy, should our house be yellow or blue?" she asked, holding up 2 crayons. "Whatever color makes you happy, baby," I replied, not looking up from the case file I was reviewing. "I think yellow," she decided. "Yellow is a happy color and we're happy in our house." Her innocent observation made me pause for a moment. Despite all the stress of my job, despite the challenges I faced every day, despite the discrimination I endured from people like Hawthorne, we were happy. Zara was thriving, I was doing work that mattered, and we had built a good life together. I was reviewing my notes one final time, making sure I had all my arguments organized and my evidence properly documented, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Maya, D.A. Hawthorne wants to see you in his office. He says it's about the Marcus Williams case." I felt my stomach tighten. Hawthorne rarely requested meetings about plea negotiations. Usually, those discussions happened through intermediaries or informal settings. A personal meeting could mean either very good news or very bad news, and given my history with Hawthorne, I suspected it wouldn't be good. I looked at Zara, who was contentedly drawing what appeared to be a family of stick figures holding hands. She had been so good all morning, entertaining herself quietly while I worked, and I hated to disrupt her peaceful concentration. "Sweetie, Mommy has to go to a quick meeting. Can you be good right here?" She nodded, not looking up from her coloring. "I'll draw you a picture, Mommy. It's going to be you and me and Mr. Buttons at the park." "That sounds beautiful, baby. I'll be back in just a few minutes." I made sure my assistant would keep an eye on her and headed to the DA's office, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever confrontation awaited me. As I walked down the corridor, I ran through my arguments one more time, reminding myself to stay calm and professional no matter what Hawthorne said or did. The moment I walked into his office, I could feel the tension in the air. Hawthorne was seated behind his massive oak desk, looking through paperwork with an expression of barely concealed irritation. There were 2 other prosecutors in the room, both white men who I'd dealt with before. One was David Fletcher, a man in his 30s who usually handled drug cases, and the other was Robert Chin, who specialized in violent crimes. The presence of other prosecutors was unusual for a plea discussion, and it immediately put me on edge. This felt less like a negotiation and more like an ambush. "Ms. Johnson," Hawthorne said without looking up from his paperwork, "I've reviewed your request for a plea deal in the Williams case. Denied." I had expected this, but I wasn't going to give up easily. "Sir, with respect, the evidence is circumstantial at best. The witness identification was made under poor lighting conditions, and there are significant gaps in the prosecution's timeline." He finally looked up, and I saw that familiar look of annoyance cross his face. Ms. Johnson, your client is a career criminal at 17. He's exactly the kind of person who needs to be taken off the streets permanently. He has one prior misdemeanor for shoplifting when he was 15, I countered. That hardly makes him a career criminal. You people always want to make excuses, he said, his voice rising slightly. Maybe if parents in that community actually raised their children properly, we wouldn't have this problem. The room fell silent. The two other prosecutors looked uncomfortable, but neither said anything. I felt my heart racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean by you people, sir. I'm here as Mr. Williams' attorney, advocating for what I believe is a fair resolution to this case. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Of course you are. You're all the same, bleeding hearts who want to coddle criminals instead of protecting law-abiding citizens. I knew I should leave. I knew I should walk out of that office and report this conversation to my supervisor. But something inside me snapped. I'm here because I believe in justice, sir. Real justice. Not the kind that assumes guilt based on zip codes and skin color. His face turned red. How dare you suggest that race plays any role in how I prosecute cases? I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've never what? I interrupted. Never noticed that you prosecute black and brown defendants more harshly? Never noticed that you're more willing to offer plea deals to white defendants? Never noticed that you speak to me differently than you speak to my white colleagues? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I think this meeting is over, Ms. Johnson. And I think you need to remember your place. My place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Your place as a public defender representing criminals. Don't forget that you work for the same taxpayers who pay my salary, taxpayers who expect us to keep dangerous people off the streets. I was about to respond when I heard a small voice from the doorway. Mommy? I turned to see Zara standing in the entrance to the office, her coloring book clutched in her small hands. She must have gotten restless and come looking for me. Sweetie, Mommy will be right there, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But Hawthorne saw an opportunity. He looked at my daughter with the same dismissive expression he'd been giving me, and his voice took on a mocking tone. Well, bring your daughter to work day? He walked around his desk and looked down at Zara. What's your name, little girl? Zara looked up at him with her big, innocent eyes. Zara. Zara, he repeated as if testing the name. That's an interesting name. Is that African? I felt my chest tighten. It's Arabic, actually. But I don't see how that's relevant. He ignored me and continued talking to Zara. You know, Zara, your mommy defends some very bad people. People who hurt others, who steal things, who make neighborhoods unsafe. Sir, that's inappropriate, I said, stepping closer to my daughter. But he kept going. Maybe if your mommy chose better clients, you wouldn't be eating government cheese. Maybe she'd have enough money to put you in a real school instead of wherever it is you go. The room went completely silent. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. This man, this elected official, this supposed pillar of the community, had just made a racist comment about my 3-year-old daughter. But then something extraordinary happened. Zara, who had been listening quietly, looked up at Hawthorne with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 3 years. My mommy helps people, she said in her small, clear voice. She helps people who don't have anyone else to help them. That's what heroes do. Hawthorne's smirk faltered slightly. Well, that's very nice, but... And we don't eat government cheese, Zara continued, her voice growing stronger. We eat mac and cheese that mommy makes, and it's the best mac and cheese in the whole world because she makes it with love. I felt tears prick my eyes. My 3-year-old daughter was defending our family's honor with more grace and dignity than I had ever seen from a trained attorney. But she wasn't finished. My mommy says that judging people by how they look is wrong. She says that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, even when they make mistakes. The 2 other prosecutors in the room were staring at Zara, and I could see something shifting in their expressions. This wasn't just a child repeating something she'd heard. This was a little girl who understood right from wrong in a way that the adults in the room seemed to have forgotten. Hawthorne's face had gone from red to pale. Well, I think we're done here, he said, but his voice lacked the authority it had held just moments before. Yes, I said, taking Zara's hand. I think we are. As we walked out of his office, I could hear him behind us, trying to make light of the situation with the other prosecutors. Kids say the darndest things, don't they? But nobody laughed. The days following that meeting were some of the most difficult of my career. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the courthouse, carried by the 2 prosecutors who had witnessed Hawthorne's behavior and by my assistant, who had heard enough of the conversation through the office door to understand that something significant had occurred. I found myself at the center of a storm I hadn't asked for. The legal community in Atlanta is surprisingly small, and news travels fast. By the end of that first day, I had received calls from 3 different attorneys asking if the rumors they'd heard were true, if Hawthorne had really made racist comments about my daughter and my community. Some of my colleagues were supportive, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories of dealing with Hawthorne's behavior. Maria Santos, a Latina attorney who worked in immigration law, stopped by my office the next morning with coffee and a sympathetic ear. "Maya, I heard about what happened," she said, closing my office door behind her. "I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Hawthorne has been saying things like that for years." She told me about an incident from 2 years earlier, when Hawthorne had suggested that she should stick to immigration law, because that's where her people belonged. She had been considering filing a complaint, but ultimately decided against it because she was afraid of the professional consequences. "I regret not speaking up," she said. "Maybe if I had, you wouldn't have had to go through what you went through yesterday." Similar conversations happened throughout that first week. David Kim, a Korean-American prosecutor who worked in the DA's office, reached out to me quietly, sharing his own experiences of being passed over for promotions while less qualified white colleagues advanced. Jennifer Washington, a black attorney who did family law, told me about comments Hawthorne had made about her attitude whenever she advocated strongly for her clients. But others seemed to pull away as if my speaking out had made me radioactive. Conversations would stop when I entered rooms. Some attorneys who had previously been friendly became distant and formal. I understood their fear. In a profession where relationships and reputations matter enormously, taking on the DA could be career suicide. The pressure was particularly intense because Hawthorne wielded enormous power in the local legal community. He had connections throughout the courthouse, friendships with judges, influence with bar associations, and the ability to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. Attorneys who relied on plea negotiations knew that antagonizing him could result in harsher treatment for all their future clients. But it wasn't just the professional consequences that were weighing on me. The personal impact was profound and immediate. That night, after Zara had gone to bed, I sat alone in my kitchen and really processed what had happened. The way Hawthorne had spoken to my daughter, the casual cruelty of his words, the assumption that because I was a black woman doing public defense work, I must be poor and unworthy of respect. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my anger, all the microaggressions I had endured, all the moments when I had chosen to keep my head down rather than speak up. I thought about the message I was sending to my daughter, that it was okay for people to treat us as less than, as long as we were polite about it. I thought about my grandmother who had worked 3 jobs to give me opportunities she never had, who had taught me to be proud of who I was and where I came from. What would she think of me accepting this treatment? What would she think of me allowing someone to speak about her great-granddaughter that way? The Marcus Williams case became even more contentious. Hawthorne seemed determined to make an example of both Marcus and me, refusing any plea negotiations and pushing for the maximum sentence. He assigned his most aggressive prosecutor to the case, a man named Thomas Bradley who had a reputation for winning at any cost. Bradley immediately began playing hardball, filing additional motions, requesting delays that would keep Marcus in jail longer, and demanding a trial date that would give me minimal time to prepare. It was clear that this was about more than just prosecuting a crime, it was about sending a message that challenging Hawthorne would have consequences. I found myself fighting an uphill battle against a system that seemed designed to crush both my client and my spirit. Every motion I filed was met with aggressive opposition. Every piece of evidence I presented was challenged more vigorously than usual. Every argument I made was scrutinized with unusual intensity. The stress was affecting my home life as well. Zara, with the intuitive sensitivity that children possess, began asking questions that broke my heart. "Mommy, why do you look sad when you come home from work? Are the bad people at your job being mean to you? Is it because of what that man said about us?" I tried to shield her from my struggles, but it was impossible to completely hide the stress I was under. She had heard enough of the conversation in Hawthorne's office to understand that something unpleasant had happened, and she was smart enough to connect my mood changes to that incident. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that other attorneys were watching me differently. Some with sympathy, others with curiosity about what I would do next. There were whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, and I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me. Some colleagues offered support in private but made it clear they couldn't afford to take public stands. Others suggested that I should let the matter drop, that pursuing it further would only hurt my career and my clients. Maya, one senior attorney told me during a chance encounter in the courthouse hallway, I admire what you're trying to do, but you need to think about the bigger picture. Hawthorne will be DA for years to come. You can't win a war against him, but you can lose everything trying. But there were also voices encouraging me to keep fighting. Judge Patricia Williams, the same judge who had presided over several of my cases, asked to see me in her chambers one afternoon. Ms. Johnson, she said once we were alone, I've been in this courthouse for 20 years, and I've seen Richard Hawthorne treat attorneys of color differently than their white colleagues. I've always wished someone would have the courage to call him out on it. Your Honor, I'm not sure what I can do. He's careful never to cross the line far enough to create grounds for a formal complaint. Maybe, she said, but maybe he's gotten overconfident. Maybe this time he went too far. She didn't explicitly tell me what to do, but her message was clear. She believed that what had happened was wrong and she thought I should pursue it. The breaking point came during a pre-trial hearing for Marcus. I was presenting a motion to suppress evidence, arguing that the police search had been conducted without proper warrant. It was a solid argument, backed by precedent and constitutional law. I had spent hours researching similar cases, and I was confident in my legal reasoning. The evidence in question was a backpack that had allegedly been found near the scene of the crime. The police claimed it contained items linking Marcus to the robbery, but they had searched it without a warrant and without Marcus's consent. Under the Fourth Amendment, such evidence should be inadmissible. I presented my argument clearly and methodically, citing relevant case law and constitutional principles. I explained why the search violated Marcus's rights and why admitting the evidence would compromise the integrity of the judicial process. But when I finished my presentation, Hawthorne stood up and addressed the judge with a tone I had never heard him use before. Openly dismissive and condescending, as if my legal arguments were beneath consideration. Your Honor, Ms. Johnson's argument is typical of the kind of technical maneuvering we see from public defenders who care more about freeing criminals than protecting victims. This motion is frivolous and I think we all know it. Judge Williams looked at him with raised eyebrows. Mr. Hawthorne, I'll determine whether the motion has merit. Please address the legal issues rather than making personal attacks on counsel. But Hawthorne wasn't finished. His voice took on an edge that made it clear he was no longer just talking about this specific case. Your Honor, with all due respect, the Public Defender's Office has a responsibility to the taxpayers who fund their salaries. When they waste the court's time with arguments like this, they're not serving justice, they're serving their own agenda. I felt the familiar burn of anger in my chest, but this time I didn't try to suppress it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every public defender who had ever been dismissed as less competent than their private counterparts, every attorney of color who had been told their arguments were frivolous, every client who had received inadequate representation because their lawyer was too intimidated to fight hard. I stood up slowly, my voice steady and clear. Your Honor, I object to the district attorney's characterization of my motion. I am here to provide my client with zealous advocacy, as guaranteed by the Constitution. If the district attorney has legal arguments against my motion, I welcome them. But personal attacks on my professionalism and dedication are inappropriate and irrelevant. The judge nodded firmly. Sustained. Mr. Hawthorne, please confine your remarks to the legal issues at hand. But as I sat back down, I could feel Hawthorne's eyes on me, and I knew that this was far from over. He had made it clear that he saw me as more than just an opponent. He saw me as a threat to his authority, to his image of how things should be. The courtroom was silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Other attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances, understanding that they had just witnessed something significant. This wasn't just a routine legal disagreement. This was a public confrontation between a powerful DA and a young attorney who had refused to be intimidated. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my mentor, Judge Sarah Coleman, who had been retired for several years but still served as an informal advisor to young attorneys like me. Judge Coleman had been one of the first black women to serve on the bench in Georgia, and she had faced challenges that made my current situation seem minor by comparison. Judge Coleman, I said when she answered the phone, I need your advice. And I need to know if I'm crazy for thinking about doing something that could end my career. She listened quietly as I told her about the incident with Zara, about the pattern of behavior I had observed, about the way Hawthorne seemed to target me specifically. I described the mounting pressure I was feeling, the advice from colleagues to let the matter drop, the fear that speaking out further would destroy my ability to help my clients. When I finished, there was a long pause. Maya, she said finally, I've known Richard Hawthorne for 20 years. He's a man who believes that his position makes him untouchable, that he can treat people however he wants as long as he gets results. The question isn't whether you're crazy, the question is whether you're brave enough to do what's right. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes the system doesn't fix itself. Sometimes, it takes someone with the courage to speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Even when it's risky. We talked for another hour, discussing the potential consequences of taking action and the potential consequences of remaining silent. She shared stories from her own career, times when she had faced discrimination and had to choose between her comfort and her principles. The hardest lesson I learned, she told me, is that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Every time we allow discrimination to go unchallenged, we make it easier for it to happen again. By the time I hung up, I knew what I had to do. But I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I called in sick to work and spent the day at the public library researching. I pulled up news articles, court records, and bar association complaints going back 15 years, the entire length of Hawthorne's tenure as district attorney. What I found was a pattern that was both subtle and devastating. Hawthorne had a history of treating attorneys of color differently, of making comments that walked the line between inappropriate and illegal, of using his position to intimidate and silence those who challenged him. But most telling were the cases themselves. I found statistical evidence that defendants represented by attorneys of color received harsher sentences than those represented by white attorneys, even when controlling for the severity of the crime and the defendant's criminal history. I found evidence that plea deals were offered more frequently to white defendants than to black and Latino defendants. It was exactly the kind of systemic discrimination that was hard to prove in individual cases but became undeniable when viewed as a pattern over time. I also found something else. Other attorneys who had had similar experiences with Hawthorne but had never spoken up. I reached out to several of them and one by one they began to share their stories. There was Maria Santos, a Latina attorney who had been told by Hawthorne that she should stick to immigration law because that's where her people belonged. There was David Kim, a Korean-American prosecutor who had been passed over for promotions repeatedly while less qualified white colleagues advanced. There was Jennifer Washington, a black attorney who had been subjected to comments about her attitude whenever she advocated strongly for her clients. As I compiled these stories, I realized that what had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of discrimination and abuse of power. But I also knew that stories alone wouldn't be enough. I needed something more concrete, something that would force people to pay attention. That's when I remembered something that most people didn't know about me. Before law school, I had worked as a paralegal for a firm that specialized in civil rights cases. I had learned about the power of documentation, the importance of creating a record that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. I also remembered something else, something that might be the key to everything. Georgia is a one-party consent state, which means that I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant. And I had been carrying a small digital recorder in my purse for weeks, ever since the incident with Zara, just in case Hawthorne said something else that crossed the line. I had been planning to use it to protect myself, to have evidence if he tried to retaliate against me professionally. But now I realized it could be used for something much bigger. The next morning I went to work with a plan. I requested a meeting with Hawthorne to discuss plea negotiations for Marcus Williams. I knew he would refuse, but I also knew that he wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to lecture me about my unrealistic expectations and my misguided loyalty to my client. I was right. When I walked into his office he was already in attack mode. "Ms. Johnson," he said without looking up from his paperwork, "I hope you're not here to waste my time with another frivolous plea request. I'm here to discuss the possibility of resolving this case in a way that serves justice," I replied, making sure to speak clearly. He looked up then and I could see the familiar disdain in his eyes. "Justice? Is that what you call it when you try to help criminals escape the consequences of their actions?" "I call it ensuring that every defendant receives fair treatment under the law, regardless of their background or circumstances." He leaned back in his chair, and I could see him settling in for what he clearly viewed as an opportunity to put me in my place. "Let me explain something to you, Ms. Johnson. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've seen hundreds of attorneys like you come and go. You all think you're going to change the world, save the criminals, fight the system. But the truth is you're just naive." "Naive about what?" "About the people you're defending. About the communities they come from. About the culture of violence and irresponsibility that produces defendants like Marcus Williams." I felt my heart racing but I kept my voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean by communities they come from or culture of violence, sir. Could you be more specific? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Don't play dumb with me. You know exactly what I mean. These people, your people, they don't value education, they don't value family, they don't value hard work. They have children they can't afford, they commit crimes instead of getting jobs, and then they expect the rest of us to feel sorry for them. My people? I repeated, making sure the recorder was picking up every word. Black people, Ms. Johnson. Your community. And don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. You've seen the statistics, the crime rates, the incarceration rates, the welfare dependency. There's a reason for those numbers, and it's not because the system is unfair. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was beyond anything I had imagined, even in my worst fears about his character. So you believe that black people are inherently more criminal than white people? I believe that some communities have cultural problems that lead to criminal behavior. And I believe that attorneys like you do those communities a disservice by making excuses instead of demanding accountability. He was warming to his theme now, apparently convinced that he was giving me some kind of valuable lesson. Take your daughter, for example. She seems like a sweet kid, but what kind of future does she have? Growing up in a single-parent household, watching her mother defend criminals for a living, learning that the system is always against her instead of learning to take responsibility for her own actions. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Leave my daughter out of this. What? She's the perfect example of what I'm talking about. You're raising her to be a victim, to blame everyone else for her problems instead of working hard and making good choices. My daughter is 3 years old. Exactly. And she's already learning the wrong lessons. She's already being taught that she's entitled to special treatment, that rules don't apply to her, that society owes her something because of her race. I thought about Zara in that moment, about her wisdom, her kindness, her instinctive understanding of right and wrong. And I thought about this man who had so much power over the lives of people who looked like her, who thought about her in these terms. Mr. Hawthorne, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me, I want to make sure I understand your position. You believe that black people are culturally predisposed to criminal behavior, that black children are being raised with the wrong values, and that attorneys who advocate for black defendants are doing a disservice to society. I believe that facts are facts regardless of whether they're politically correct. And the fact is that certain communities have higher crime rates, higher incarceration rates, and higher rates of social dysfunction. Pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. And you believe this affects how justice should be administered? He leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. I believe that justice should be blind, Ms. Johnson. But I also believe that some people are more likely to reoffend than others, more likely to be a danger to society, more likely to squander second chances. Based on their race? Based on their background, their community, their culture. Race is just one factor among many. I sat there for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then I asked the question that I knew would seal his fate. Mr. Hawthorne, how do you think voters in this district, particularly black voters, would react if they knew that their elected district attorney held these views? His face changed immediately. The casual arrogance disappeared, replaced by something that looked like panic. I think this conversation is over, he said, standing up abruptly. I think you're right, I replied, standing as well. But I want to thank you for being so honest about your views. It's helpful to understand where you're coming from. As I walked out of his office, I could feel his eyes on my back. He knew something had changed, but he couldn't quite figure out what. That afternoon, I made copies of the recording and stored them in multiple locations. Then I called Judge Coleman. I have it, I said when she answered. I have everything we need. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked. I thought about Zara, about Marcus Williams, about all the defendants who had been denied fair treatment because of one man's prejudice and abuse of power. I'm sure, I said. It's time. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Working with Judge Coleman and several other retired judges and attorneys, I prepared a comprehensive complaint to the Georgia State Bar Association. The complaint included not only the recording of my conversation with Hawthorne but also the statistical analysis I had compiled, the testimonies of other attorneys who had experienced discrimination, and a detailed pattern of behavior that stretched back years. But I knew that a bar complaint alone wouldn't be enough. Hawthorne had too much political power, too many connections, too much control over the narrative. I needed to make sure that the public knew what kind of person they had elected to represent them. That's where an old friend came in. Jessica Martinez was an investigative journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who had won awards for her coverage of corruption and civil rights issues. We had gone to law school together, and she had always been passionate about exposing injustice. When I played her the recording, she was silent for a long moment. "Maya," she said finally, "this is explosive. But are you prepared for what's going to happen when this goes public?" "I'm prepared for whatever happens," I replied. "I can't let him continue to use his position to harm people. He's going to come after you hard. He's going to try to destroy your career, your reputation, everything. Then I'll have to be stronger than he is." The story broke on a Tuesday morning, just as the courthouse was opening for business. The headline read, "District Attorney Caught on Tape Making Racist Comments About Defendants and Colleagues." The article included not only excerpts from the recording but also the broader pattern of discrimination that I had documented. The reaction was immediate and intense. By noon, there were protesters outside the DA's office calling for Hawthorne's resignation. The governor's office issued a statement calling the comments deeply troubling and unacceptable. The Georgia NAACP demanded a full investigation. But the response that mattered most to me came from an unexpected source. That evening, as I was walking out of the courthouse, I was approached by a young man I didn't recognize. "Ms. Johnson," he said. "I'm Marcus Williams." I looked at him more carefully and realized that this was my client, the 17-year-old whose case had started this whole chain of events. "Marcus," I said, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I heard about what happened, about what you did. I wanted you to know that nobody's ever stood up for me like that before." We talked for a few minutes, and I learned that Marcus had been following the story closely. He told me that he had never understood why some attorneys seemed to fight harder for their clients than others, why some defendants got better deals than others who had committed similar crimes. "I always thought it was just bad luck," he said. "I never realized that it might be something else." As he walked away, I realized that this case had been about more than just exposing one man's prejudice. It had been about shining a light on a system that had been failing people like Marcus for years. Over the next few days, more stories emerged. Other attorneys came forward with their own experiences. Other defendants shared stories of harsh treatment that now made sense in a new context. The statistical evidence I had compiled was examined by experts and confirmed by independent analysts. Hawthorne tried to fight back, of course. He held a press conference where he claimed that his comments had been taken out of context, that he was being targeted by political opponents, that he had always been fair and impartial in his prosecutions. But the recording spoke for itself. There was no context that could explain away his casual racism, no interpretation that could make his comments acceptable. The final blow came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the story broke, I received a call from an unknown number. "Ms. Johnson? This is Judge Patricia Williams. I wanted to let you know that I've been reviewing cases that came before my court over the past several years, looking for patterns and sentencing recommendations from the DA's office." "What did you find?" "Exactly what you would expect. Significant disparities in recommended sentences based on the race of the defendant and the race of the defense attorney. I'm preparing a formal complaint to the Judicial Council, and I wanted to thank you for bringing this to light." A week later, Richard Hawthorne announced his resignation, effective immediately. In a brief statement, he said that he was stepping down to focus on personal matters, and that he wished his successor well. But the real victory came in the courtroom. The Marcus Williams case was reassigned to a different prosecutor, who immediately offered a plea deal that reflected the actual strength of the evidence. Marcus would serve 6 months in a juvenile facility and 2 years of probation, with the charges dropped entirely if he completed his GED and stayed out of trouble. It was exactly the kind of deal that should have been offered from the beginning, the kind of deal that gave a young man a second chance instead of destroying his future. A month after Hawthorne's resignation, I was at home with Zara, helping her with a coloring book, when she looked up at me with those bright, curious eyes. "Mommy," she said, "remember that mean man at your work?" I felt my heart skip a beat. "What about him, sweetheart?" "He said mean things about us, but they weren't true, were they?" I set down my own crayon and looked at my daughter. This remarkable little girl who had stood up to a powerful man with nothing but her own sense of right and wrong. "No, baby, they weren't true. Sometimes people say mean things because they're scared or angry or confused. But that doesn't make the things they say true." "I know," she said, going back to her coloring. "I know because I know who we are." And in that moment I realized that she was right. The most powerful thing we can do in the face of prejudice and discrimination is to know who we are, to hold on to our own truth so tightly that no one else's lies can shake us. I thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the risk, the victory. I thought about all the people who had been hurt by Hawthorne's prejudice, all the defendants who had received harsher treatment because of the color of their skin, all the attorneys who had been diminished and dismissed because they didn't fit his narrow vision of what a lawyer should look like. But I also thought about the changes that were already happening. The new district attorney was a black woman named Michelle Thompson, who had run on a platform of reform and equality. She was already reviewing cases, implementing new policies designed to eliminate bias in prosecutorial decisions, and working to rebuild trust between the DA's office and the communities it served. One of her first acts was to establish a review board that would examine cases from the Hawthorne era, looking for evidence of discriminatory treatment and working to correct injustices that had occurred. She also implemented new training programs for prosecutors on implicit bias and cultural competency. Michelle had called me personally to ask if I would serve on the review board, a request that both honored and humbled me. It felt like coming full circle, from being the target of discrimination to being part of the solution. More importantly, the conversation had changed throughout the legal community and beyond. People were talking about systemic racism in the justice system, about the ways that prejudice could affect everything from plea negotiations to sentencing recommendations. Law schools were adding courses on bias and discrimination, bar associations were implementing new ethics training, and young attorneys were being encouraged to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment. The statistical analysis I had compiled became the basis for several academic studies on prosecutorial bias. Legal scholars used it to demonstrate how discrimination could be hidden in patterns that weren't visible in individual cases. Civil rights organizations used it as evidence in lawsuits challenging discriminatory practices in other jurisdictions. But perhaps most importantly, other attorneys began speaking up about their own experiences. The culture of silence that had protected people like Hawthorne for so long began to crack. When discrimination occurred, people reported it. When bias was evident, people called it out. When young attorneys faced unfair treatment, they had support networks and resources to help them fight back. I had learned something important about courage, that it's not about being unafraid but about acting despite the fear. When I walked into Hawthorne's office that day with my recorder, I was terrified. I was terrified of losing my job, of being blacklisted, of facing retaliation that could destroy my career and my ability to support my daughter. But I was more terrified of what would happen if I did nothing. I was more terrified of the message I would be sending to Zara, that it was acceptable to be treated as less than, that powerful people could say and do whatever they wanted without consequences, that her voice didn't matter. The truth is, I didn't expose Richard Hawthorne's racism. He exposed it himself with his words, his actions, his casual cruelty. All I did was make sure that people heard it, that it was documented, that it couldn't be denied or ignored. And in the end, that's what changed everything. Not my courage, not my cleverness, not my legal skills, but the simple act of making sure that the truth was heard. There were moments during this whole experience when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. When colleagues warned me about the consequences, when I saw the stress affecting Zara, when I wondered if I was destroying my career for nothing. But every time I wavered, I thought about all the defendants who had been treated unfairly, all the attorneys who had been diminished, all the future victims of Hawthorne's prejudice. I thought about Marcus Williams, whose case had started this whole chain of events. Thanks to the new DA's review, his conviction was overturned and the charges were dropped entirely when it became clear that the evidence against him had been tainted by prosecutorial bias. He was now enrolled in community college and working toward his goal of becoming a teacher. I thought about Maria Santos, who had been inspired by my example to file her own complaint about discrimination she had faced from a family court judge. That complaint led to an investigation that revealed a pattern of bias against Latino families, ultimately resulting in the judge's removal from the bench. I thought about all the young attorneys of color who had reached out to me, sharing their own stories and asking for advice about how to handle discrimination. Many of them had found the courage to speak up about unfair treatment, knowing that they weren't alone and that change was possible. As I tucked Zara into bed that night, she looked up at me with those wise 3-year-old eyes. "Mommy," she said, "are you still a hero?" I smiled and kissed her forehead. "I'm just someone who tries to do the right thing, baby. Just like you." "Good," she said, settling into her pillow. "Because the world needs more people who do the right thing." And as I turned off her light and closed her door, I realized that she was absolutely right. The world does need more people who do the right thing, more people who speak up when they witness injustice, more people who refuse to accept discrimination as normal, more people who believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The system doesn't fix itself. It's fixed by people who have the courage to demand better, who refuse to accept that prejudice and discrimination are just the way things are, who believe that change is possible even when it seems impossible. Over the following months, I received hundreds of letters and emails from people across the country who had heard about the case. Some were from attorneys who had faced similar discrimination, others were from defendants who felt they had been treated unfairly, and many were from ordinary citizens who were grateful that someone had stood up for justice. One letter that particularly moved me was from a retired federal judge who wrote, "Your courage reminds us that the arc of justice doesn't bend toward fairness automatically. It requires individuals who are willing to grab hold of it and pull it in the right direction." Another came from a law student at Howard University who said, "You've shown me that being a lawyer isn't just about knowing the law, it's about having the courage to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against you." But the most meaningful response came from my grandmother, who was now 87 and still sharp as ever. When I called to tell her about Hawthorne's resignation, she was quiet for a long moment. "Baby girl," she finally said, "I'm so proud of you. You remember what I used to tell you about not letting nobody make you small?" "Yes, Grandma." "Well, you didn't just refuse to be small. You helped other people stand up tall too." Richard Hawthorne thought he could intimidate me into silence. He thought that his position, his power, his connections would protect him from consequences. He thought that a young black woman and her 3-year-old daughter were no match for his 15 years of entrenched authority. He was wrong. They judged me by my skin. I showed them the strength of my soul. They underestimated my daughter's wisdom. She showed them what real courage looks like. They thought they could silence us with fear and intimidation. We showed them that truth is louder than prejudice, that justice is stronger than corruption, that love is more powerful than hate. And in the end, that's what made all the difference. Not the recording, not the evidence, not the news coverage, but the simple, powerful truth that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin, the accent in their voice, or the neighborhood they come from. That's the lesson I want Zara to remember. That's the lesson I want every young person to understand. That's the lesson that can change the world, one conversation, one stand, one moment of courage at a time. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to speak your truth, even when your voice shakes, even when you're afraid, even when the whole world seems arrayed against you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that you're not alone, that there are others who have been waiting for someone to speak up, someone to take that first step, someone to show them that change is possible. That's what real victory looks like. Not the resignation of one prejudiced official, but the awakening of a community that refuses to accept injustice as normal. Not the end of racism, but the beginning of a conversation that can lead to real change. And it all started with a 3-year-old girl who knew the difference between right and wrong, who saw through the lies and the hatred to the truth underneath, who reminded us all that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice is the simple, unshakable knowledge of who you are and what you stand for. She judged us by our skin. We showed them the strength of our souls. And in the end, that made all the difference. The fight for justice is never over. There will always be other Richard Hawthornes, other systems that need reform, other moments when good people must choose between comfort and courage. But now I know that change is possible, that one voice can make a difference, that speaking truth to power is not just a noble ideal but a practical necessity. As I finish telling this story, Zara is now 4 years old, still wise beyond her years, still confident in her own worth, still believing that her voice matters. When people ask her what she wants to be when she grows up, she doesn't just say, a princess, or a teacher, anymore. Now she says, I want to help people like Mommy does. And I know that whatever challenges she faces in her life, whatever discrimination or prejudice she encounters, she will face it with the knowledge that she has the power to fight back, that her voice matters, that she can make a difference. That knowledge, that unshakable faith in her own worth and her ability to create change, is the most precious gift I can give her. It's more valuable than any inheritance, more powerful than any privilege, more lasting than any achievement. Because in a world that too often tries to diminish us, the most radical act is simply refusing to be diminished. In a system that too often tries to silence us, the most powerful response is finding our voice and using it. They judged us by our skin. We showed them the strength of our souls. And that made all the difference.